Hello fellow Unreal Engine artists, designers and developers, and welcome to another tutorial in this landscape material series. Today we're going to create a 4-layer material based on the slope of the terrain. It's going to be a slightly longer tutorial in the series, but well worth it, as this will be the foundation for your automatic material texturing. So let's get straight into it. In today's episode, we're going to go from a single layer landscape to 4 layers on our landscape. If you haven't already, make sure you followed the first 2 episodes. The link to the playlist is in the description below. And the first thing we want to do is get the textures for our 3 new layers. So if you, again, follow the links in the description below, and you should find links to 3 textures. So grass, soil and cliffs. So first thing to do is to follow those links and click on Add to My Library. So do that for all 3 of the links I've sent you, and then go back to your Unreal project, go into Window, Fab, and if you switch to My Library, you should see your textures in there that we've just added. So we've already got a forest path, which we're using for our ground layer. So we want to add mossy grass, stony soil, and rock cliff for the other 3 layers. So I will go to mossy grass first, and we're choosing medium quality for all of our assets here. So just make sure that says medium quality, add to project, and you'll see it's downloading here, and will be in a folder in a second. There it is. Close that down, go back and go into stony soil, do the same again, add to project, and that's done. And finally go back and choose the rock cliff and add to my project, and that's done. So if we close down the Fab window, if you go into your content browser, you'll see that under Fab, Megascans, Surfaces, you now have 4 different folders here: forest path, mossy grass, rock cliff and stony soil. And now would be a good time to just hit Ctrl-Shift-S to save all of those assets. And now we're ready to proceed with our 4-layer landscape material. I've opened up our master landscape material, and you can see in the center here we've got our first layer, our landscape layer. And to create the 3 other layers, you might be tempted to simply copy this and paste it 3 times. Problem with that approach is that if we ever want to change anything in the layer or the way it works, we're going to have to change it in 4 different places, which is not great for maintenance. So a better approach is to collapse all of these nodes here into a function, and then we can simply call that function for each layer. And if we change the way the function works, it will apply to all layers equally. So that'll be much more productive and efficient for the future. So how do we collapse this into a function? Well, first thing we want to do is just tidy this up a bit, because we've got a lot of duplicates here. We've got the same name twice for near UV, same name twice for far UV depth fade mask. So we only want single instances of all our inputs. So let's just sort that out first of all. So for our near UV, let's delete the second one here, and then connect the near UV up to that. Similarly, let's get rid of our second far UV and connect the far UV here to it. The depth fade mask appears twice as well. So again, let's delete the second one and connect the depth fade mask here to this lerp node. And I think that is it, except for one thing, which is the texture parameters here. We've got base color twice and normal twice. And this will have to be done slightly differently, because we can't simply delete one of these and then take the output from there, because it'll be a different tiling. So let's move over here and just shift our UVs and depth fade mask there, just to create a tiny bit more space. And if I zoom in here a bit more, let's move our near UV and far UV further away. So what we want to do is we want to create a parameter, a texture object parameter that we can plug into these two base color parameters. So if you right click down here and look for texture object, and let's make the first one the white grid by default. And if you go to our base color, and you'll probably have to, I was going to wonder if we could convert it back into a texture sampler, but we can't here. So what we'll have to do is we'll have to temporarily delete these, right click and do texture sample, and duplicate that with Control D. And now what we can do is we can plug in our, first of all, our near UV and far UV. Then we'll plug in our texture object parameter. Actually, is this a parameter? No, it isn't. So delete this texture object and instead choose texture object parameter. And this is going to be called base color. And make sure that you've got the white grid selected as the default. Okay, so now we can plug that into the two textures, and finally remember to plug the output RGB into lerp A and lerp B. And let's just move that up here so it's a bit tidier. Okay, same thing for the two normals here. So let's delete those two normals here. Let's duplicate our texture object parameter and set that to grid underscore N for the, as a default. And what we'll do now is we will copy our texture samples, plug the near UV into the first one, plug the far UV into the second one, plug our, actually we need to change the name of this now to, instead of base color, we'll do it, call it normal. And we'll plug that into the texture. And finally, connect the RGB output to part A, input A of the lerp and input B of the lerp. Okay, let's do a save. It says there are a couple of errors. Simply make sure that it's the right type for each texture. So this one here is a normal. This one here is a normal. This is a color. This is a color. Let's save that. And the reason I'm getting the error is because I didn't rename this second one. It applied it to the first texture object here. So we need to reset that first parameter here back to the white grid. And now all our errors have gone. So just to recap, we've deleted all our duplicate entries here. So we've got a single near UV plugged into the texture sample here and here. A base color parameter that's plugged into the textures for 1 and 2. The far UV is plugged into the second texture and the second normal. Normal parameter here is plugged into these two texture samples. We have a single depth fade mask as well. We used to have 2 of those plugged into the alphas here. I think that's everything. Let's just check the samples. The only thing we need to change is because we've reset these up, these are all set up as from texture asset and we need them to be shared wrap. So go through the 4 texture samples and change them to shared wrap. I should say, by the way, I didn't meant to say this in introduction, this tutorial of the series is probably going to be the longest by quite a way, because we've got a lot of things to set up, like 4 layers, layer masks and layer blending. So it is going to be a bit of a slog today, but once you've got through this, all of the other tutorials should be much simpler by comparison. So stick with it and you'll have a good result at the end. All right, so we've set up our landscape layer here with single inputs for everything. Now what we need to do is collapse it into a function. So to do that, select everything. We don't want to select any input parameters. So ignoring these 4 on the left hand side, select everything else in this landscape layer, and using the control key we'll deselect the other inputs. So we'll deselect the color tint parameter, the depth fade mask, and down here the normal intensity. So just take a second just to look at that, and you can see all of the nodes that are highlighted will go into our material function. And right click on one of these nodes. Let's use the material attribute so we don't deselect everything, and you've got this option collapse to function here. So click on that, and what we'll actually do is we're in our materials folder here at the moment. What we'll do is we'll right click and create a new folder called material functions. Double click to go into that, and let's call this function mf_create layer, and click on save, and you'll see that everything has collapsed into a node here, and all of our inputs are plugged into that. You might have some errors at the moment, but don't worry, we'll sort that out. Let's just clean up this input set here first. So let's move everything around a little bit. That. Now you've got some errors at the moment, but we'll sort that out at the moment. It's probably because the parameters have not been set up with the correct type in our material function. So if you now double click on this material function, it will take you to, if it's not already open, it will take you to your material function. Mine's on another screen somewhere. Oh, it's over here. So let me just drag it over, and you'll see that we have all of those nodes now in this material function with various inputs. So let's go through and start to clean those up. So the first one here is our color tint. So let's rename that to, let's give it a name of color tint. Okay. The next one here, if we take this near UV and pull this up, it's saying here the functional input is scalar, which is a single value. Well, that's wrong, because a UV is 2 coordinates. So we need to change that to vector 2. Otherwise, we'll get some issues with the tiling of our texture. Next is our texture object, and that is not a scalar either. That is a texture 2D. So we'll change that. Next, we've got our depth fade mask, so we'll drag that over here so that it's nicely connected. That is a scalar value, so that's fine. Then we've got the far UV, and that is also a 2-dimensional vector. Next one is a texture object, which is a texture 2D. And in fact, we didn't rename these. So the first one up here, we want to call texture base color. And the one down here we'll call texture normal. And then this one here is our normal intensity. So let's move it over to where it gets applied, and it is a scalar value, and we'll just call this normal intensity. Okay, so that's looks okay. Let's go back, do a save. Let's go back to our landscape and have a look. Okay, we don't have any errors at the moment. These parameter names still aren't applied yet, but that's maybe because we have to reload this function to kind of jig it into updating it. However, what we'll also do before we do that is we'll change the input order to get the order the way we want it. So go back to here, and what we'll do is we will do the base color. You see here there's a sort priority, so let's go through and put these in the order we want them to appear in the function. So for the texture base color, we'll make that first. The color tint we'll make second. The normal texture we'll make third. Normal intensity fourth. Near UV fifth. Far UV sixth. And finally depth fade mask seventh. Let's do apply and save. And you can see actually that's updated now. So we now have the order we want, texture, and the names we want: texture base color, color tint, texture normal, normal intensity, near UV, far UV, and depth fade mask. So now we can just move these around to be in the right order. So again, we don't get overlapping node cables. So that's our normal intensity, and our near UV, far UV, depth fade mask. So congratulations, you've created your first material function. We ought to test this out though. So let's click on save. So everything's looking the same as it was before, which is a good sign. But now let's update this layer to change the parameters on the material instance. So if you look at the material instance here, we've still got these materials sort of all over the place, sorry, parameters all over the place, and we want these parameters now to be in a group for the ground layer. So let's go back to our main landscape and let's rename this ground layer, and let's go through and start to name these parameters for the ground layer. So for the first one, all we're going to do is prefix the parameter names with ground. And let's create a new group here called one ground. I'll come back and do the sort order in a minute. Let's just go through and change all of these. So ground color tint. So I'm hitting F2 on each of these to rename them. Ground normal, F2. Ground normal intensity. The near UV, far UV, and depth fade mask stay the same for each layer, so that is fine. Let's just change the sort order. So go to the first one, and we'll do literally in this order: 1, 2, 3 for the normal, and 4 for the normal intensity. Oh, and don't forget to change the groups as well to use our new ground group. So I'm going back up the ones I missed and changing them to ground. Okay, click save, and over on your material instance you should now have your parameters for the ground layer nicely organized in a group called one ground. So base color, ground color tint, ground normal, and ground normal intensity. And click on save. And again, everything looks the same. So before we create our next layer, let's tidy up this material function. I realized that it's got quite a few crossing cables, and this will probably cause us confusion in the future. So let's tidy this up and organize it a bit. So let's take our UVs first, and let's put the UVs in their own separate area. And then we'll use named reroute nodes just to get rid of these overlapping cables. So quick way to set up named reroute nodes between cables where they're already connected is you can double click to create a join here, and then if you right click on that, you can convert to named reroute, and you see it creates both sides of the named reroute. So what we'll do is we'll call this first one near UV, and we'll set it to our usual purple color. And now what we can do is we can duplicate this one here and connect that to the texture sample down here. Okay, so that's a little bit neater. Same thing for the far UV, double click on the connection, right click, convert to named reroute, and actually we can do F2 here. Rather than go to the left hand side and call it far UV, and don't forget to change the color to purple, and let's move this out of the way a second. Let's put that here, and Control D to duplicate it and connect it to the UV down here. Okay, so we've got rid of those overlapping areas here. Let's do a similar thing for the textures. Actually, let's just now put a comment around here and call this UVs. You may have wondered, by the way, that I used the same name for the reroute node that I did in the master material. The reroute node names are only relevant in the material or material function in which they exist. So this near UV is not the same as the near UV in the master material, in case you were wondering. Okay, let's do the same thing for the textures. So again, double click, convert to a named reroute, and call this one texture base color. Change the color. Duplicate this one. Put it into our texture. Okay, and we'll take our normal up here, double click on one of the connections, convert to named reroute, F2 to change the name, texture, normal, move that up there, move this one down here, duplicate it, and connect it to the last texture here. Okay, and now we can comment this and say textures. And then finally we can put a comment around here and say, in fact, let's delete that comment, and let's split this into two parts. So I'm going to select this and delete the comment. And what I'll do is I will comment all of these ones here and call this base color tiling. Let's just move that a bit out of the way, and then we'll select all of these ones down here beneath the depth fade mask and call this normal tiling. Again, it'll just be helpful for when we do future work, we'll know exactly what each part of the function is doing. And then one thing we haven't done as well is we didn't rename the output name. It was called this make material attributes. So what we'll do is we will change that to landscape layer material as an output. Okay, and click on save. Nothing should change because all we've done really is tidy up the cabling. So let's go back to the landscape material, the master landscape material. Everything looks the same here, and let's just double check nothing's changed. No, that's good. Okay, so now we're in a position to create our next layers. So in our master landscape material, we're going to have 4 layers in total. We're going to call them the ground layer, mid-low layer, mid-high layer, and cliffs layer or cliff layer. So let's start off by creating the mid-low layer. So I will select everything in this ground layer box, do Control D to duplicate and drag it down here. If you have problems like that where it's dragged the material output with you, put that back. If you prefer to do Control C and Control V, that might be easier to position it where you want. So now we've got a new copy here. Let's start renaming all of our attributes. So let's start off with the comment box and call this mid-low layer. Choose our first one here and call it mid-low base color. So we're just going to replace the word ground in all of the parameters. So click on all of them, F2, change the names. Mid-low normal. Mid-low normal intensity, and we want to now create a group for that as well. So going through each parameter in turn, we'll create a new group which we'll call 2 mid-low, and then go through each parameter in turn, just making sure it's assigned to the mid-low group. So actually it's not too onerous to do this. And finally, to test out this layer, let's connect it to our main output. So let's put the main output here, and instead of our ground layer, we will attach our mid-low layer. Click on Save, go to your valley, and it should now be showing you the grid, because that's the default textures for each layer. So over on the right hand side you will see 0 landscape general. You may be confused as why you don't see 1 ground. The material parameters are quite clever in that if that part of the material is not actually connected to an output, it won't show the parameters on the material instance, which can be quite useful when you're switching features on and off. So let's go into our mid-low area and we will activate our 4 parameters, and now we can change the base color and normal texture to our mossy grass. So click on here, do mossy, and you should find here a base color. Looks grassy. And for the normal, again type in mossy and choose the one suffixed with N for normal, and now you have grass, and that looks pretty good, and it should be obeying the same features of the standard layer, which is that you have tiling when you're far away, and when you get close the tiling gets close, although it's a bit difficult to see in here because it's quite a densely packed texture. So that's our mid-low texture done. Let's move on and do the mid-high texture. So back to the main landscape, let's do a Control-Shift-S to save everything, and you've guessed it, we are selecting the mid-low layer. I'm doing Control-C this time and then moving down and Control-V so I don't accidentally take that output. Okay, and now we're going to start renaming everything again. So start with the comment box, and we'll call that mid-high, and go through each of the parameters, changing the mid-low to mid-high. So I'm using F2 to change the name. Mid-high normal, and finally mid-high normal intensity. And now go through each parameter, and in the left-hand details box, create a new group called 3 mid-high, and assign the other parameters to that mid-high. Okay, and let's now save that. Let's zoom out a bit and connect the output to our final output. Click on Save. Going back to the landscape, and we have a grid pattern because that's our default. Over on the right hand side on our material instance, we now have a new group, mid-high. Let's switch on all those parameters, and now we'll assign the soil, stony soil, to this mid-high layer. So go into the base color, type in stony and choose the base color, and for the normal do the same thing, type stony and choose the normal, and now we have a stony soil texture. A couple of things with this is that it's very red, so we might want to do a color tint, but let's leave that until we've blended them together, and we can fix that later on. And the other thing, again, which we might fix later on as well, is that the tiling seems a little bit on the large side. I believe this is scanned at 0.5 by 0.5 meters, where our other textures are more like 2 by 2 meters or 3 by 3 meters. So at some point we'll probably want to add a variation, a tiling multiplier for near tiling and far tiling for each layer, but we can do that in a later episode, because this is going to be, as I said, quite a long episode putting all these layers together. Okay, that works well. Let's do a save, and let's go back to our landscape and do our final layer. So choose our mid-high layer, Control C, down in the empty space, Control V, and let's go through doing all of the renames again. So start off with the comment, we'll call it cliff layer, and go through each parameter, F2, cliff base color, cliff color tint, cliff normal, and cliff normal intensity, and go to the first one and create a new group here called for cliff, and assign that group to the other 3 parameters. For cliff, and for cliff. Okay, let's test this one out. So take the output, drag it all the way up to the final output, click on save for the material, come out here, we've got a grid, we have a new group in our material instance, we will set those all up, and we'll now assign our cliff textures to the base color and normal. So cliff, base color, and normal, cliff, normal. And we have this craggy cliff face, which looks quite nice up in the distance here. And again, might want to change the tiling, but we can do that at a later stage. All right, so we now have 4 layers. Let's zoom out a bit here. So you can see that in our master landscape, we have the 4 separate layers. But at the moment, all we've done is connect each layer individually to test it out. What we now need to do, and this is the real sort of meat of this episode, is we need to create masks that will blend these together in the way that we want. So let's do that now. Before we start creating our masks, there's a couple of errors we need to sort out in the material function. If you completely shut down your project and then open it up again, if you go into your material function create layer, you'll see these errors. Not sure why they didn't appear when we saved the project the first time, but they're easily fixed. First of all, it's left a couple of reroute nodes lying around, so we can just select those and delete them just to clean them up. They're not causing the error, they're just a bit of a cosmetic annoyance. The problem here is that the texture base color and texture normal is expecting a default input. So let's just give it that. So right click in the empty space here, do texture object, and actually let's create 2 of these, Control D to duplicate, and let's make them our usual defaults. So first one is going to be the white grid. Second one is going to be the grid normal, so grid _n, and just attach those to this preview here. And then you might need to go into the input node and just say use preview value. Do that there, click on apply and save, and hopefully all those errors have now gone away. So we'll never use these previews because we'll always be plugging something in for each layer, but you really need that just to make the errors go away. Okay, with that out of the way, let's look at the mask creation. Right, so we're back in the master material, and let's talk about what we're going to do before we actually implement it. For each layer, we're going to create a mask based on the slope of the landscape so that we can layer our different materials on top of each other based on the slope. It's actually pretty simple to do. So if we go to the section where we created our depth fade mask, and underneath that, we'll create our first slope mask. So right click in the empty space and type slope, and you will see something called slope mask here. And it has a few parameters, but the only one we're really interested in is this fall off power. So if you have a fall off of 0, it basically means that it is going to appear everywhere on the landscape. So it's not really constraining the slope at all. And then as you go higher in value, it will restrict the mask by slope. So let's put a parameter in here. Let's steal this blend distance start and duplicate it. Let's F2 to rename it, and we'll call this ground slope mask. So we'll do this for the first layer. And we'll set the default value to 30, which is a number where it's kind of pretty much constrained. In fact, the parameter name is not the slope mask, it's really the slope constraint. So let's change that instead of mask to constrain. So if it's 0, we won't be constraining the slope at all. If it's higher numbers, it will be constraining the slope more and more. And we'll plug that into the fall off power. And we then need to just test this out just to see what it looks like. So temporarily what we'll do is we'll drag out the result, do a make material attributes so that it plugs that mask into our base color. And then if you zoom out a bit, we'll connect that output into the final output. And then we can play around with the parameter values to see what it does. So click on save. Go back here, and you can see that our mask at the moment with a value of 30 is constraining it to just the flat portions of the landscape. So you can see it's mainly in this valley and maybe slightly on the ridges as well. So let's see what happens if we change that slope constraint value. So over in the parameter groups, we've got this ground slope constraint value. If we make it 0, you can see now the mask is not constraining by slope at all. If we put it up to, it's most of the landscape, just not the very steep cliffs. And you can see as you put the value up, it constrains it more and more. So this mask is doing exactly what we want. And once we've set up the mask for each layer, what we'll then do is use those masks to blend the different layers together. So let's continue and set up the different masks, and then the final thing in this tutorial episode will be to use the mask to blend everything together. Okay, so let's now delete that make material attributes, and we'll use a named reroute for the output. So click on here, add named reroute, and we'll call that ground slope mask. And as per normal, we'll make it purple. And let's comment this and say ground slope mask. And now we need to set up our other masks as well. So let's copy this, Control C and Control V. Let's call this mid-low slope mask and change the parameter to mid-low slope constrain, and the named reroute node we'll call mid-low slope mask, and then we'll do our next one, Control C, Control V, and again change the name, mid-high slope mask, change the parameter to mid-high slope constrain, and change the named reroute to mid-high slope mask. And these parameters here we want to actually put in the groups for the ground, mid-low and slow and mid-high. So go to the first one and choose the ground group, and the sort priority, remember we had 4 parameters already, so make that 5, and then do the same for the other 2. Mid-low slope constraint goes in mid-low and is also priority 5, and finally mid-high goes into mid-high and is also priority 5. And you may be thinking, why haven't I created a cliff mask? Well, it's not necessary, because once we've applied the ground slope mask, the mid-low slope mask and the mid-high slope mask, whatever's left is going to be the cliff. So we don't need to do a mask, it's just what's remaining on the landscape. So if you want to, you can plug these into a make material attributes and test them out. So if you want to, pause the video here for a second and try that out just to see what they look like. But I'm pretty confident that these masks are all correct. Right, we're almost there. So the final thing we need to do is blend our material layers together using these slope masks. So let's move this final output. If I can get in there, pick it up. Let's move that a little bit out of the way to start off with. And then in between our material layers and the final output, we'll start to create the blend. So we'll do this in stages. So what we're going to do is we're going to work down from the cliff layer to the ground layer, each time blending using one of these masks. So first of all, in fact, we need to do some outputs for our layers first of all. So if you go to each of these layers, we'll do a named reroute. So the output here, we'll add this, add a named reroute, and we'll call this ground material. This one here we'll call mid-low material. Next one we will call mid-high material, and finally we will add a named reroute at the bottom called cliff material. And if you just zoom out and select those 4 named reroutes, we'll set them to our usual purple color, and then just expand out the comment node to encapsulate it. Okay, so now we have those named reroutes, we can start to do the blending. So let's zoom in on this empty space here, and first thing we'll do is we will right click and choose our cliff material, and we will right click and choose our mid-high material. So those are the top 2 layers we want, and then what we're going to do is we're going to blend them together using the mid-high slope mask. And the way you blend materials together is not with a lerp node, because there are many attributes in here, but with a special node called blend material attributes. So right click, do blend material, and you'll find this blend material attributes. So it looks like a lerp, it's got an A and a B, an input and an alpha, but it's blending all of the attributes of the materials together at the same time. So we will plug the cliff into the top, the mid-high material, and then for our alpha we're going to use our mid-high slope mask. So if there is no mask value here, it will just show the cliff. If there is anything in that slope mask, it will start to show through the mid-high material. And let us connect that to the output and test it out. So click on save, go back to our valley, and you can see, it depends on the attributes you've got, you can see that we've got our mid-high soil at the bottom, we've got our cliff at the top. Let's just change the values to see if anything changes here. So over on our material instance, let's go to our mid-high slope constraint. If we make that 0, then the stony soil is everywhere. If we make it 30, it's just in the flat areas. And if we do it in between, 5, 4, 3, 2, it blends in between. So that's working nicely. So let's leave it at around about the 2 value so that it does go up the sides, and when we add the next layer we'll be able to see that as well. So let's go back to the landscape. That worked really well, so let's do the next thing. So now we want to use our next material, so that is the mid-low material. Let's put it over here, and let's also find the mid-low slope mask. And now what we want to do is we want to take the output from here, so the blend of the top 2 layers, and we want to blend the next layer below. So we want to do another blend material attributes, plug in the mid-low material and the mid-low slope mask, and plug the output into the final output. So now we've blended in our next layer below. Click on Save, come back to the valley, and now we have grass at the bottom layer, but we still have our blend of the stony soil and the cliffs above. So let's go into our mid-low layer, choose the slope constraint, and let's play around with that. If we make it 0, grass everywhere. If we make it 30, it's just on the flat. So let's go down to something like 5, 4 to give it more, 3, 2. So you can see at 2, it's the same as the stony soil constraint. So effectively it's taking up the slope areas that did before. So let's do it something like 2.5. So you can see a little bit, it's mainly grass, but you can see a little bit of the stony soil as well. Okay, so we just now need to add in our grain layer, and then we are done with this 4-layer blending. So back to the landscape, maybe a Control-Shift-S to save everything so we don't lose what we're doing. And now we will right-click here and choose our ground material, and then right-click and choose our ground slope mask, and do our final blend. From the output where we've blended everything already, blend material attributes, plug in our ground material, plug in our ground slope mask, and this is our final output. Click on Save, and you can see now we have the soil here. So we have soil, we have grass, stony soil, and cliffs in the far distance. You can see even here where we've got a little divot in the ground because of the slope, we've got a bit of grass and soil as well. So let's play around with the values in the ground. Let's choose the ground slope constraint. If we make it 0, then we have the ground layer everywhere. If we have 30, we have it just at the base, and if we have it in between, you can see that it just takes up part of it. Let's actually leave that at 30 so that it's on the flat layer, and let's just make it so that the grass goes up the hill a bit more. So what I'll do is I'll make the mid-low slope constraint a bit lower. Let's make that 2, and then maybe make the mid-high constraint a little bit higher. And you can just play around and see how it blends the grasses with the soil and the cliffs. But you have now created your 4 layers here. And you can see that all of our parameters here are neatly organized. We're starting off with our general parameters, with our tiling and our blend distance. These apply to all layers equally. And then we have for each layer the colors and normals, the variations, and the different slope constraints for each layer. So for example, if we wanted to make the cliffs more pronounced, we could go down to our cliff layer, and under the normal intensity, if I wanted these cliffs to look really craggy, I can put that up to 10. Obviously that's too much, but if we just put it up to 2 or 3, it just makes the indentations a little bit more pronounced. Maybe even 3 is too much. I'll go back to 2. So I hope you found today's tutorial useful. It was quite a long one today because obviously we needed to create our own material function, or our first material function I should say, create 4 layers, create our slope mask and blend it together. But as I said, this was kind of the heavy lifting tutorial. All of the other ones will be much shorter in comparison. And so in the next episode, we're going to create a 5th layer specifically for snow. But this is not going to be based on slope. This is going to be based on height. And we're also going to use some noise masks in order to break up the snow a bit as well. So stay tuned for that one, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye for now.